Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christoph Kühn. I am the Dean for Academic Affairs at the Faculty of Architecture and Planning at the TU. And I'm very happy to give a brief introduction, like Pier Paolo did in the morning. And I hope that you can hear me in spite of the horrible acoustics in this place. I am very proud that this conference is taking place at the TU Vienna, not least because it would actually fit better with the Academy of Fine Arts, an institution with which the TU has been in a more or less friendly competition since 200 years. At the time of the first publication of the Entwurff in 1721, there was no polytechnic in Vienna for another 100 years. But there was indeed an Academy of Fine Arts with classes for painting, sculpture, and architecture founded in 1691 on the model of the Paris Academy. It was there in Paris that the querelle des anciens et des modernes, the famous battle between the old and the moderns, began in 1687. With a lecture by Charles Perrault, in which he questioned antiquity as an absolute standard in literature. His brother, Claude, one of the architects of the Louvre colonnade and author of a critical translation of Vitruvius, claimed the same for architecture. The task of the arts was no longer to emulate antiquity, as in the Renaissance, but to surpass it. By 1721, the debate had long since been decided in favor of the moderns, among whom Fischer von Erlach undoubtedly counted when he included in his publication designs for the Karlskirche and the Kollegienkirche in Salzburg in his book. Against the backdrop of the querelle, Fischer certainly understood himself and his architecture as radically modern. The relationship to history was also behind the dispute between the Vienna Polytechnic and the Academy of Fine Arts, which culminated in the personal feud between Otto Wagner and Karl König at the end of the 19th century. König regarded architecture as a science. In his inaugural speech as rector at the Vienna Polytechnic in 1901, titled The Science of Architecture and Its Practical Significance, he claimed that a work of art that is to please us must above all not pose any riddles. König's science of architecture was art history, which had a long tradition at the Polytechnic, starting with Durand's famous collection and comparison of the architectural world, first published in 1800. In spite of this fabulous collection, Durand advocated an anti-historical architecture based on classicism, a language that he believed to be universally comprehensible, at least in the Occidental world, which was the world that Durand cared for. In his course of architecture, he proposed a universal design method based on this language, allowing for typological variations. For Durand, the purpose of architecture was its social utility. He compares St. Peter's in Rome with an alternative design, more or less based on the old Roman St. Peter, that would have spared, I quote, 3/4 of Europe centuries of misfortune, so to say, the Reformation Wars. Moreover, Durand continues, in today's St. Peter, only a fraction of the faithful have a view on the Pope. What a bad church building, again a quote, ignorant of the true principles of architecture. So much dry utilitarianism is not surprising in Durand, but very much so in another architect, Otto Wagner. In his 1898 text, Die Moderne im Kirchenbau, Modernism in Church Construction, he follows in Durand's footsteps. In the illustration, he groups 4 church plans around the plan of the Karlskirche in the middle and makes calculations about it. How high are the building costs? How many worshippers have view of the altar? In terms of costs, his design was on par with another, but in terms of the number of worshippers with a view of the altar, this is the last paragraph, Wagner's design is almost 50% better. Wagner already had professed this attitude in 1895 in the first edition of his book, Modern Architecture, with a set of 4 rules: painstaking comprehension and perfect fulfillment of purpose, down to the smallest detail being number 1. The other 2 then refer to material and to construction, and then there is this wonderful formula, this magic formula, only after considering these 3 main points, the form arising from these premises. It flows into the pen of its own accord and always becomes easily comprehensible. Wagner's motto, used on competition plans he submitted, was Artis sola domina necessitas. It was taken from Gottfried Semper, who claimed that art knows only one master, necessity. But this motto is only half of Wagner's creed. On his first villa in Hütteldorf, he puts it on marble plates on one of the 2 lateral towers. On the other comes the complementary addition, sine arte, sine amore, non est vita. So you see these tables, the pink marble tables on either side of the villa. For Wagner, finding the balance between these 2 demands is the central task of architecture, not only in the design of buildings, but also in urban planning. In his text on the metropolis, published in 1911, this is stated right away in the introduction. The principle of Wagner's urbanism was, on the one hand, the most painstaking fulfillment of the purpose, but on the other hand, art had to consecrate everything that came into being in the implementation of this purpose. And the final sentence of the whole text reads, "May the representatives of large cities consider that a large city can only fulfill its purpose of being a satisfactory place of residence for a population of millions if the city is also beautiful. But this can only be achieved through art." In this position, Wagner is as ardent an artist as Camillo Sitte, but for Wagner, in contrast to Sitte, beauty is totally artificial. Let us take a brief look on what Wagner's metropolis would have looked like. It must be, as Wagner writes, unlimited in its extent. It consists of self-sufficient units that can grow into infinity, as you see here. The overall plan shows this network without borders. The detail for 150,000 inhabitants shows a system that one would never have to leave, fully supplied with gardens and water. The whole city would have had about 6 to 8 million inhabitants. And if you look closer at this plan, it looks very rational at first view, but if you look more closely, there are a lot of streets not in parallel with each other, not standard situations, and I think that Wagner on purpose chose one of those irregular units so that he could implement these variations in the final plan. The bird's eye view shows, a totally artificial nature that has a striking resemblance to the artificial nature of the hanging gardens of Babylon from Fischer's Entwurff. Even the Euphrates is substituted by a water basin of monumental dimensions. Is this a coincidence? Did Wagner unconsciously refer to an image he had once seen? Or is the image a conscious reference to a historic example for a most elaborate artificial nature? But hadn't Wagner cut the last ties to history when, in 1911, he dropped the term modern architecture from his vocabulary entirely and published the 4th edition of his book on modern architecture in 1913 under the title Die Baukunst unserer Zeit, the architecture of our time, inspired by Hermann Muthesius, who wrote this text on Baukunst, nicht Stilarchitektur. Wouldn't it be inconsistent for such an architect to link the metropolis of the future with a metropolis that experienced its peak 3,800 years ago? The answer to this can be found in a quote by Josef Frank, a generation younger than Wagner. In his book Architecture as a Symbol, he writes in 1930, "Our time is all the historical time known to us." This is the question I would like to leave you with. Has modern architecture in Vienna always been historical? Thank you very much.